Welcome to Karen Speaking Beautiful. Help me to grow this content by subscribing my channel. Here is story of the day. The piercing wail of the alarm shattered the quiet night. Red lights pulsed like a warning beacon, casting frantic shadows along the garage walls. Karen stood frozen in place, eyes wide, mouth parted in shock as the blaring siren screamed in her ears. She fumbled backward, nearly knocking over a stack of storage bins. Her hands trembled as she reached for the doorknob, but it refused to budge. The door had locked behind her. From the safety of his living room, I leaned back in my chair, watching the live security feed. A slow smirk crept across my face as I took in the sight of my nightmare neighbor, my so-called HOA president, trapped like a rat in the very garage she had been so desperate to snoop through. She had no idea that this entire moment had been orchestrated. Karen had always been a problem, but this was her biggest mistake yet. It started small, the way these things always do. At first, she was just another annoying presence in the neighborhood, an older woman with an overinflated sense of authority and an unshakable belief that she alone dictated the community's rules. The official HOA had an actual governing body, but Karen? She ruled through intimidation, self-importance, and a never-ending supply of passive-aggressive emails. My first real clash with her came about a month ago when I received a formal violation notice in my mailbox. Unapproved lawn ornament, remove immediately. It was a garden gnome. A harmless, painted ceramic gnome sitting peacefully near my front walkway. I had placed it there because my grandmother had given it to me and it reminded me of home. Karen, however, had deemed it an eyesore that did not align with the neighborhood's visual harmony. I had ignored the notice. The next day, Karen showed up at my door. I barely had time to register her stiff, judgmental expression before she launched into a lecture about community standards. She never raised her voice. No, she was too calculated for that, but her words were sharp, clipped, meant to imply authority rather than request compliance. Rules exist for a reason, she had said, clasping her hands neatly in front of her. And those who live here must respect them. I had stared at her for a long moment before responding. You know, it's just a gnome, right? Karen hadn't been amused. The gnome mysteriously vanished later that night. That was just the beginning. Over the following weeks, she escalated her campaign against me, finding new and creative ways to make my life hell. Trash bins too close to the curb? Violation. A car parked for more than 48 hours? Warning. A barely noticeable oil stain on my driveway? Another infraction. And then came the garage. Karen had decided, completely on her own mind you, that I was hiding something in there. Maybe it was because I kept it closed most of the time, or maybe she had just run out of things to complain about. Either way, she fixated on it like a bloodhound on a scent. She sent emails, left voicemails, even accidentally stopped by while I was working in my yard to mention that, per HOA guidelines, storage areas should remain accessible for inspection. I had laughed in her face. You think I need your approval to keep my own garage closed? She hadn't laughed back. Instead, she pursed her lips, gave me one of those long, smug looks and simply said, "We'll see about that." That was when I knew she was going to try something. Karen had this way of making things personal, turning petty inconveniences into power struggles. And if she wanted a fight, she was going to get one. I made my preparations. I installed motion sensors, upgraded my security cameras, and rigged the garage with alarms that would trigger the second anyone unauthorized stepped inside. And now here she was, caught in the trap. The alarms continued to wail, and Karen stumbled toward the control panel, hands shaking as she tried to silence them. It was futile, there was no easy way out. She had been so certain she was untouchable, so convinced she could do whatever she pleased without consequence. I picked up my phone and dialed. The second her own phone rang, she jolted. I let her answer first. Through the security feed, I watched her press the device to her ear with a kind of desperate, forced composure, as if she could still salvage what little dignity she had left. "Karen," I said smoothly, "you seem to be in my garage." There was a long pause. Then, voice tight, she said, "This is a misunderstanding." I chuckled. "Oh, I don't think it is." Another pause. A beat of tense silence. Then, in a voice dripping with forced confidence, she said, "I had reason to believe you were storing unauthorized." I cut her off. "Karen, you broke into my property. At night, while I wasn't home." Through the screen I saw her jaw clench. "I am the HOA president," she tried, her voice cracking ever so slightly. "And I am the homeowner," I replied. "Which means legally you're trespassing." She swallowed. I let the silence stretch between us, let her sit with the weight of what she had done. Her fingers twitched at her side and I could see it, She was calculating her next move, trying to find an escape route. But there wasn't one. "I'm going to unlock the door," I said finally. "And when I do, we're going to have a nice little chat about consequences." A flicker of panic crossed her face. She had never expected this. And that was the best part. Karen's breathing was ragged, her hands clammy as she clutched her phone. The deafening alarm had finally ceased, leaving behind an eerie, suffocating silence. But the damage was done. Her heart hammered in her chest as she stared at the locked garage door, every muscle in her body tensed with the primal urge to flee. The only problem? She had nowhere to go. I watched from my screen, savoring every second of her panic. She had spent so long controlling everyone else, dictating what they could and couldn't do, making the entire neighborhood bend to her ridiculous standards. But now she was the one cornered. And she knew it. She spun in frantic circles, scanning the walls, searching for anything, any way to turn this situation around. But my security system was thorough. The reinforced locks weren't something a nosy suburban tyrant could pick with a paperclip and a prayer. Every move she made, I saw it. Every ragged breath, every flicker of desperation. She had walked into my space, my home, thinking she could assert her power. And now she was realizing the truth. This was my domain and she was nothing but an intruder. I took my time unlocking the garage door. The quiet click of the deadbolt was barely audible over the tension stretching between us. I pushed it open slowly, just enough to let the cold night air spill in. Karen flinched as if expecting something worse, her eyes darting toward me with an unreadable mix of anger and humiliation. There she was, standing in the middle of my garage, her perfect posture wilted, her carefully composed expression cracking at the edges. Her expensive blouse was wrinkled, her carefully styled hair disheveled. The image of the untouchable HOA president had been reduced to a frantic, trespassing mess. I leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, letting the silence stew. "Looking for something?" I finally asked, my voice light, teasing. Karen straightened as if physically forcing herself back into the role she had so carefully crafted over the years. She smoothed her hands down her blouse, squared her shoulders and lifted her chin. But her usual poise didn't carry the same weight here. Not in my space. Not with the undeniable truth of what she had done hanging between us. "This is," she faltered, cleared her throat, then tried again. "This is a misunderstanding." A slow, amused smile spread across my face. "A misunderstanding?" I repeated. "Karen, you broke into my garage. You picked the lock. You set off my security system. And now you're standing here, acting like this is some sort of unfortunate coincidence." Her lips pressed into a thin line. I could see the wheels spinning in her head, trying to weave a narrative that would put her back in control. Karen wasn't the type to admit fault. No, she was the type who doubled down, who twisted reality until she could shape it into something that suited her. "I had reason to believe," she began, carefully choosing her words, "that you were storing unauthorized materials on the property. As HOA president, it is my duty to ensure that all homeowners comply with community regulations. I was merely—" I let out a low chuckle, shaking my head. "Oh, Karen," I said, stepping closer. "You weren't ensuring compliance, you were snooping. You were breaking in, you thought you could get away with it just like you always do." She bristled. "I was within my rights." "No," I cut her off sharply, my voice firm now. "You weren't." She flinched. I took another step forward, watching as she shifted uneasily. "Tell me something," I continued. "What exactly were you hoping to find in here? Drugs? Weapons? Some secret underground operation? Because I have a feeling even you don't know." Karen's jaw tightened. Her silence was answer enough. "You just didn't like that I said no to you," I said, the realization hitting with a satisfying clarity. "That's it, isn't it? You're so used to people giving in that the idea of someone telling you no was just unacceptable." She opened her mouth, then shut it again. For the first time since I had known her, she seemed at a loss for words. I exhaled slowly, letting my amusement fade into something colder, sharper. "You do realize this is a crime, right?" I asked, tilting my head. "You do realize that breaking and entering isn't just some HOA infraction you can brush under the rug?" A flicker of something, fear maybe, crossed her face, but it was gone just as quickly. "The HOA," she started. "The HOA isn't the law," I interrupted smoothly. "You don't get to make the rules just because you put president next to your name in a neighborhood newsletter." She swallowed hard, her bravado slipping. She knew she had messed up. The only question now was how much worse this was going to get for her. I let the silence stretch, let her squirm. Then, slowly I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. I made sure she saw the screen, made sure she saw the little red recording dot in the corner. Karen's face drained of color. You've been live this whole time, I said casually. My security system records everything. So if you were thinking of spinning some story about how I was the one at fault here, you might want to reconsider. For a long stretched out moment she just stared at me. Then finally she spoke. What do you want? It wasn't quite surrender, but it was close. I smiled. Oh, don't worry, I said, pocketing my phone. We're just getting started. Karen's lips pressed into a thin, bloodless line. Her eyes flicked between my phone and the garage door, as if weighing her options, calculating whether there was still a way out of this without losing everything. The problem was she had already lost. She just didn't know how badly yet. The silence between us stretched, thick with unspoken consequences. The old Karen, the one who knocked on doors with fake smiles and veiled threats, the one who issued violations like royal decrees, was gone. What remained was someone scrambling for control in a situation where she had none. I want to resolve this, she said finally, voice measured, carefully restrained. Without unnecessary escalation. I laughed, the sound sharp and cold. Escalation. Karen, you escalated the second you broke into my property. You want to talk about unnecessary? That would be you standing in my garage right now, trying to act like you're still in charge. She exhaled through her nose, her nostrils flaring. It was not my intention to cause harm. Oh, spare me, I shot back. You didn't do this out of concern for the neighborhood. You didn't accidentally pick my lock in the middle of the night. You were looking for something to use against me because you can't stand the fact that I don't bow to you like the rest of the neighborhood. Her fingers twitched at her sides. I could see her biting back words, fighting the instinct to snap at me the way she always did with the other homeowners. But she wasn't dealing with someone who cared about HOA bylaws and neighborhood politics. She was dealing with someone who had finally had enough. I took another step toward her, just close enough to watch her mask slip further. So here's what's going to happen, I said evenly. I have you on camera breaking in. I have a full audio recording of this conversation. And I have zero problem sending all of this straight to the police. Karen swallowed but otherwise didn't react. That means, I continued, you'd be looking at criminal charges. Actual legal consequences, Karen. Not just an embarrassing little rumor at the next HOA meeting. A flicker of something passed through her eyes, genuine fear. It was the first real emotion I had seen on her face all night that wasn't rooted in arrogance or indignation. Good. I let the weight of my words settle, watching her struggle with the realization that she wasn't getting out of this clean. That her name, her reputation, was about to take a hit she couldn't control. She inhaled sharply. You don't want to do that. I raised an eyebrow. Oh. She squared her shoulders, regaining a sliver of her usual bravado. I have influence, she said carefully. More than you realize. If this gets out, I can promise you, it won't just be me who suffers. It was almost impressive, really. Even with her back against the wall, she was still trying to spin the situation into a threat. But I wasn't one of her scared, rule-abiding neighbors. Karen, I said, shaking my head. You don't have influence, you have leverage, and right now, you have none. Her mouth opened, then snapped shut again. I pressed on. You think people are going to defend you after this? After they see the footage of you sneaking into someone's private property? You're not untouchable, Karen. The only reason you got away with your power plays for so long is because no one had the patience to push back. But I do. She blinked rapidly as if trying to keep her expression from cracking further. What do you want? She asked again, voice quieter this time. I let the question hang in the air. Truthfully? I could have had her arrested right then and there. I could have called the cops, handed them the footage and watched her life unravel in real time. It would have been satisfying, satisfying. But there was something better. You're going to resign, I said simply. Her breath caught. You're going to step down from the HOA, I continued. Effective immediately. No excuses, no dramatics. You're going to write a polite little email to the board explaining that you're no longer fit to serve and that it's time for new leadership. Her jaw tightened and I could practically hear her teeth grinding. That's ridiculous, she said finally, but the fight in her voice was weaker now, almost reflexive. I have been leading this community for years. Yeah, I said dryly. And you've been making everyone miserable while doing it? You've abused your position, harassed homeowners, and now you've committed an actual crime. And unless you want to explain all of that to a judge, I'd suggest you take the deal. She was quiet for a long moment. Then, slowly she exhaled, shaking her head in bitter disbelief. I won't be bullied, she muttered. I chuckled. Karen, you are the bully. I'm just finally giving you a taste of your own medicine. She looked down, staring at the floor as if hoping it might provide her an escape from this conversation. But she knew she was out of options. With stiff movements, she reached into her pocket and pulled out her phone. Her fingers hovered over the screen for a moment, then she started typing. I watched as she composed the resignation email, her posture rigid, her expression unreadable. It was taking everything in her not to lash out, not to fight back one last time. But she knew it was over. A few seconds later she hit send. The moment the email was out in the world, permanent, irreversible, she let out a slow breath, the kind that sounded dangerously close to defeat. There, she said, voice hollow. Are we done? I pulled out my own phone, checked my inbox, and sure enough, there it was. An official resignation from Karen, sent to the HOA board. I smiled. Yeah, I said, slipping my phone back into my pocket. We're done. She moved past me without another word, stepping out into the cool night air. As she walked away, her usual commanding stride was missing. Instead, she looked smaller, diminished. For the first time since I had moved into this neighborhood, I felt something close to relief. Karen had ruled through intimidation for years, convinced she was above consequences. But tonight? Tonight she had finally learned what it felt like to lose. The neighborhood felt different the next morning. Lighter. As if the very air had been freed from an invisible grip. Karen was gone. Not literally, she still lived in that oversized, perfectly landscaped house on the corner, but her rule had ended. The resignation email had spread like wildfire. The HOA board wasted no time accepting it, and by noon the neighborhood group chat was buzzing with reactions. Some people were stunned. Others relieved. A few even celebrated openly, as if a years-long battle had finally come to an end. And Karen? She had gone radio silent. No door-to-door complaints, no passive-aggressive emails, no sudden, self-important inspections. Just absence. I half expected some last-ditch attempt at retaliation. But she knew better. The footage of her breaking into my garage still existed, and she understood that if she pushed too hard, I wouldn't hesitate to make it public. She had lost her power. If she tried to fight back, she'd only bury herself deeper. Still, something about it felt unfinished. So later that evening, when I saw her standing at her mailbox, rigid, distant, pretending she wasn't affected, I decided to give her one last reminder of what she had become. I strolled across the street, hands in my pockets, stopping a few feet away. Quiet day, huh? I said casually. Her shoulders stiffened, but she didn't turn to face me. What do you want? I tilted my head. I was just thinking. All those years of you terrorizing this neighborhood, and the moment you lose your title, it's like you don't even exist. She sucked in a sharp breath, her fingers clenching around the envelope she was holding. I smiled. Must be strange not having everyone hanging on your every word. Not having people afraid of what rule you'll enforce next. No more power trips. Just silence. She turned then, finally meeting my gaze. And for the first time since this whole thing started, I saw it. Not anger. Not indignation. Fear. Not the fear of exposure, that had already happened. Not even the fear of consequence, I had made sure she understood those. It was the fear of irrelevance. Karen had spent years molding herself into the queen of this neighborhood, controlling every little thing to maintain her influence. Without that, she was nothing. Just another homeowner. Just another person. And she hated it. Her voice was quieter when she finally spoke. You think this makes you better than me? I exhaled, shaking my head. No, Karen. That's the difference between us. I never wanted to be better than you. I just wanted you to stop. She said nothing, but the way her throat worked as she swallowed told me she had heard every word. I let the silence stretch before shrugging. Enjoy the peace and quiet, I said, turning to walk away. But just as I reached my driveway, I added one last thing, something that I knew would stick with her long after I was gone. Oh, and Karen? I called over my shoulder. She didn't answer, but I knew she was listening. I hear they're looking for a new HOA president. Maybe you should apply. The barely restrained fury in her expression was the most satisfying thing I had seen in a long time. I stepped inside my house, shutting the door behind me. And for the first time since I moved into this neighborhood, I felt something I hadn't before. Freedom.